Hello again, 102. In this part 4 video on World War I will go over the main events of the war after the United States entry and how the United States contributed to the defeat of the Central Powers. In 1917, their strategy focuses on helping the struggling French and British armies. It was very slow before the AEF makes it into Europe. And they're really needed because they've been fighting for years and these forces are worn out. And Georges Clemenceau urged the Americans to hurry over because a terrible blow is imminent. He told an American journalist about to leave Paris, "Tell your Americans to come quickly." Clemenceau was referring to the likelihood of a massive German attack, made more probable by the end of the fighting on the Eastern Front following the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the Second Revolution in November of 1917. And the Germans actually helped this to come about. They had helped Vladimir Lenin return to Russia in a secret sealed train, hoping that he would cause turmoil in his homeland. And he did much more than that, because the Tsar, Nicholas II, has already abdicated in March. And the provisional, or the White Russian government, took over. And the fatal flaw of the White Russian government was its continuance in World War I. The Russian people no longer supported this effort. They were starving and they wanted out. And Lenin will exploit this. And he is ultimately going to overthrow the provisional government under Alexander Kerensky, and eventually he's going to establish the Union of Soviet Socialistic Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union. And in November, the Communist Revolution transpires. And he declared that the world would be free from war only by a global revolution in which capitalism would be replaced by communism. And Leninists, Marxist-Leninists, advocate violent overthrow of the capitalist system, overthrow of the bourgeoisie. And he immediately wants to get Russia out of the Great War as soon as they took power. And to that end, he signed the humiliating treaty, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which got them out of the war with the Germans. And they had to transfer a lot of territory to Germany and Turkey, and they had to recognize the independence of the Ukraine, plus they had to pay reparations to Germany of 46 million. Lenin was willing to accept such a harsh peace because he needed to concentrate on his many internal enemies. This civil war in Russia will go on until 1922. The Allies, after the completion of the war on the Western Front, will actually invade the Soviet Union to try to prevent the Bolsheviks from consolidating power in Vladivostok and other key areas where military supplies were stored. They were hoping to prevent them from falling into the hands of the Bolsheviks. So that's a little known thing in American history. We actually invaded the Soviet Union. And Wilson wanted to see this revolution fail. And we're desperately needed now to help all these massive amounts of German troops coming from the east and joining the Western Front. And less than 3 weeks later, on March 21st, the Germans began the first of several spring offensives in France and Belgium, designed to win the war before the AEF arrived in force. And the Russian army was crumbling all during that time, and they were less and less German forces were needed in the east. And they will go as far as 50 miles outside of Paris, and we'll see this on a map in a few moments. But that will be as far as they get, for in June, after the Battle of Belleau Wood, one of the significant major American engagements of World War I, the U.S. forces commanded by the leader of the AEF, General John J. Pershing, they will join the French in driving the Germans back. During the ferocious fighting, a French officer urged an American unit to retreat, and in a famous exchange, the U.S. Marine Captain Lloyd W. Williams refused the order, saying, "Retreat, hell, we just got here. We're not going anywhere." And another big battle was the Meuse-Argonne offensive of 1918. and this will take place later in 1918. And there's a nice picture of forces fighting in what's left of this forest. I mean, look at the heavy environmental damage done by the years of artillery fire. This was a massive forest at one time. It's been devastated. American troops joined British and French armies in a drive towards Sedan, France, and its strategic railroad, which supplied the German army. With 1.2 million U.S. soldiers involved, including some 180,000 African Americans, it was the largest American action of the war, and it resulted in 117,000 casualties, including 26,000 dead. All along the entire French-Belgian front, however, the outnumbered Germans were in a desperate retreat because they're worn out as well. They've been fighting for years. In the early fall of 1918, America, wrote the German general Erich Ludendorff, became the decisive power in the war. The troops are fresh, and this turned the tale in favor of the Allies. And this is a nice map of the Western Front. The red line here was as far as the Germans got in their spring offensive. This was where the Allied lines were, the dotted line in March. And eventually, the counteroffensives, they're trying to get here to this railhead. And Chateau Thierry, Belleau Wood, and the Meuse-Argonne offensive are the major American engagements in World War I. And this is the Western Front then by November of 1918. Again, the fresh American troops turn the tide of the war again in favor of the Allies. And now the German generals, as you can see, they're right on the border of Germany in the south now, and they want to end this before we actually invade the fatherland. And before this, Wilson indicates his peace plan. The 14 points, one of the most famous political programs of the 20th century. He did this very early in January of 1918 in a dramatic speech to a joint session of Congress. And he described his proposal as the only possible program. Again, Wilson is very difficult to get along with. He doesn't really see any room for compromise in anything that he does. And the first 5 points are the world you live in today in the 20th century. Wilson is way ahead of his time. Open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, the reduction of armaments, which is an ongoing process in the late 20th and early 21st century, and the transformation of colonial empires into independent nations, which will transpire in the late 20th century. By 1975, most of the colonial empires are extinguished. This is radical ideas in 1918. Most of the remaining points dealt with territorial claims. They called on the Central Powers to evacuate occupied lands and urged the victors to follow the difficult principle of self-determination in redrawing the map of Europe, allowing overlapping nationalities and ethnic groups to develop their own independent nations. And point 13 called for a new nation for the Poles, a people long dominated by the Russians on the east and the Germans on the west. And the most important point for Woodrow Wilson was point 14, the post-war scheme for a League of Nations, which he thought would preserve the global peace. And when the 14 points were made public, African American leaders asked the president to add a 15th point, an end to racial discrimination. And Wilson did not respond. In October, a new German chancellor telegraphed President Wilson asking for an end to the fighting on the basis of the 14 points. The British and French agreed with reservations. The British insisted on limiting the freedom of the seas, since their navy is the key to their security. They don't really want any limits on what they do with their navy. And the French demand reparations or payments from Germany and Austria for war damages. and that's going to be included in the Treaty of Versailles, and that's going to create very, very ill will from the German people. And by the end of October, Germany is collapsing. Millions are fed up with the war, and thousands are starving as well, just as they were in Russia as well. And Bulgaria drops out, the Ottoman Empire collapses, Austria-Hungary drops out on November the 3rd, and on November the 9th, the Kaiser resigned and a republic was declared. And then on November 11th, an armistice was signed where the Germans were assured that Wilson's 14 points would be the basis for the peace conference. And finally, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, after 1,563 days of terrible warfare, the guns fell silent. From Europe, Colonel House sent a telegram to President Wilson: "Autocracy is dead. Long live democracy and its immortal leader." What's the final cost? During its 19 months of combat, the United States lost 53,000 servicemen in combat. Another 63,000 died of various diseases, including the Spanish influenza epidemic. More on that in a later video. That swept through Europe and around the world as all these people who came in contact with one another, they exchanged a lot of germs. And as a result, a new virulent strain of flu developed that wiped out way more people than the war did. More on that later. Germany's war dead totaled 2 million, more than 2 million, including civilians. France lost 1.4 million combatants, Great Britain 703,000, and Russia 1.7 million. The new Europe would be very different from the pre-war version. Much poorer, more violent, more polarized, more cynical and less sure of itself, and less capable of decisive action. And the United States, for good or ill, emerged from the war as the world's dominant power. This is the beginning of the American century.